On behalf of the Michigan Center for Civic Education, we want to welcome everyone who will be watching this video and joining us for the inaugural season of Community Conversations. My name is Ellen Zwarnstein, and I have the pleasure of directing the Michigan Center for Civic Education. MCCE is really Michigan's K-12 civic education programming and professional learning organization, really dedicated to giving students opportunities to learn their ways in our civic and public literacies and developing a better future for themselves. In particular, we champion a couple programs. One is called We the People, which results in the simulated congressional hearing, mock trial, and Michigan has the distinct pleasure of hosting the 2022 championship this May for the first time in Michigan's history. And we generally are motivated by the idea that the more students can learn about their communities, about civic possibilities, and about institutions, the more they can start to see themselves as part of the fabric of our society. So as we turn to tonight's conversation, we want to acknowledge at least two groups and individuals that have made this possible. The first, we want to recognize Glenn Ellen Lemberg, who has finished her internship here at the Michigan Center for Civic Education, who helps bring this program to life. And we also want to acknowledge the generosity of Warner, Norcross, and Judd, who have worked to help underwrite this specific series for the year. So the purpose of the community conversations serves to bridge K-12 education groups to the larger civic, governmental, and law-related education communities. We hope that it reveals the personal and professional stories that both make the experts in the field who they are, as well as bringing issues to light that we have a chance to reflect on as a society. So for this evening, we are going to focus on the stories, the experiences, and the reflections and analysis regarding the lived experiences, opportunities, and challenges facing a variety of our communities. And September provides us a lens to celebrate Latin American history and culture in the United States. We will take pause to note that there are so many opportunities to look at the intersection between what we perceive as domestic politics and international politics, and really taking a moment to bridge those two to bring understanding of what is happening at a local level also has the international implications. So together, what we hope to do is to dig a little bit deeper into this specific theme to explore the possibilities, the limits of representation, of politics, of partisanship, of boundaries and borders, and expose some of the cultural and social spirit issues that we can bring to the surface. And throughout the evening, what we'll do is ask some questions of our very generous panelists who will bring to light some issues that we're all facing in our society right now, a very timely conversation. So throughout the evening, what we'll do is listen to the presentation, we'll pose some questions, and should time permit at the end, have a slight moment to get to know Dr. Goett just a little bit more. So without further ado, we would like to introduce Dr. Goett. Dr. Jennifer Goett is an associate professor of comparative cultures and politics at James Madison College, which is housed at Michigan State University. She is a cultural anthropologist specializing in political and feminist anthropology. Her research interests include race, gender and feminist theory, social movements, human rights, violence and the state, refugees and asylum seekers, and critical security studies in Latin America. She has published work on Indigenous and Afro-descendant social movements for multicultural rights in Central America, particularly in Nicaragua, and on state violence, racialized policing, and infrastructure megaprojects. Dr. Goett is the author of Black Autonomy, Race, Gender, and Afro-Nicaraguan Activism. The book examines the gendered strategies that Afro-descendant Creole women and men use to assert autonomy over their bodies, labor, and spaces in the context of drug war, militarization, and state violence in post-war Nicaragua. Her current research projects focuses on Nicaraguan refugees in Costa Rica and the United States. Dr. Goett's articles have appeared in American Ethnologist, the Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Anthropology, NACLA Report on the Americas, and other journals and edited volumes. In addition to her scholarship, she publishes editorials on Central American politics and works as a pro bono expert witness for asylum cases and U.S. Immigration Court. So with that, we are so delighted that you are here with us tonight. We know that September often highlights a particular, chance for us to celebrate certain cultures. And we're also here to explore some of the deeper issues that might be facing in society and taking a deeper look. So we're so excited to learn with you, and we turn it over to you.
Yeah, well, it's a real pleasure to be here. And I just want to thank the Michigan Center for Civic Education for inviting me, and to you and to Glenn Ellen Leberg for helping to organize the event. I always jump at a chance to talk about Central America to US audiences, because perhaps no other region of the world has had such a long and troubling engagement with the United States. Nevertheless, there really remains a profound inability in our country to see Central America on its own terms. And by that, I mean from the perspective of national history or popular sectors, everyday people from the region. Conversely, we really don't understand as a collective body or as a nation how Latin America has shaped our own national history and our history of state formation in really significant ways. So today I want to talk a little bit about some of the most common ways that Central America in particular, I think these statements are true for Latin America as a whole, but I'm going to focus on Central America today, how Central America is perceived in the United States. The extreme power disparities between the US and Central American nations are reflected in a series of threat narratives that shape much of our political and cultural discourse about the region. There's a wonderful sociologist at UCLA named Lacey Abrego, who argues that these threat narratives obscure the conditions of violence that texture the lives of Central Americans, and also work to deny the role that the US has played in provoking that violence. She notes that the narratives themselves also have sort of a material impact in the sense that they support, in an ideological sense, intervention in the region, oftentimes political interventions or military interventions historically, as well as heightened border securitization along the US-Mexico border, so the militarization of our border with Mexico, and really punitive, very punishing immigration policies against Central Americans. And I just want to start out by saying that this isn't so much the product of one political party in power pursuing these types of policies. This is really a bipartisan problem. Since the 1980s, immigration policy has become increasingly punitive under both Democratic and Republican administrations, which have in effect, through their policies and the militarization of the border and the burgeoning kind of support for the immigrant detention industry, have worked to criminalize undocumented people seeking refuge in the United States. The Clinton administration embraced far harsher immigration policies than the Reagan and Bush administrations. I'm talking about the first Bush administration. Moreover, pre-existing policies made it possible for the Trump administration to enact its, what many have called a xenophobic and nativist immigration agenda. In her work, Abrego focuses on criminality and communism, actually, as two dominant threat narratives that focus on Central Americans in the United States. Political narratives about criminality were particularly strong under the Trump administration, who routinely characterized migrants as drug traffickers, murderers, and rapists. But we also see them actually under the current Biden administration with, Biden's press secretary saying recently that Haitians have entered the country illegally, when that's actually maybe not even true. Haitians have the right to come to the United States to ask for political asylum. So that kind of discourse, from the get-go works to criminalize Haitians looking for asylum in the United States. So as I said, it really is a bipartisan phenomenon. Tonight, I'm going to actually primarily focus on the communist threat narrative and the history of that emergent, as well as narratives about contagion, or the threat of the spread of disease that have really intensified significantly since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. So narratives about the communist threat in Central America were really firmly established in the 1980s under the Reagan administration, although they go back to the onset of the Cold War in Central America, which really kind of began or was inaugurated with the CIA-backed coup d'etat in Guatemala, which overthrew the democratically elected presidential administration of Jacobo Arbenz in 1954. But Reagan was our quintessential Cold Warrior in Central America. And I want to read a quote from one of his 1986 addresses to the nation. So, quote, "I must speak to you tonight about a mounting danger in Central America that threatens the security of the United States. This danger will not go away. It will grow worse, much worse, if we fail to take action now. I'm speaking of Nicaragua, a Soviet ally on the American mainland, only 2 hours flying time from our borders. With over $1 million in Soviet bloc aid, the communist government of Nicaragua has launched a campaign to subvert and topple its democratic neighbors. Using Nicaragua as a base, the Soviets and Cubans can become the dominant power in the crucial corridor between North and South America. Established there, they will be in a position to threaten the Panama Canal, interdict our vital Caribbean sea lanes, and ultimately move against Mexico. Should that happen, desperate Latin peoples by the millions would begin fleeing north to the cities of southern United States, or wherever some hope of freedom remained," unquote. So in this speech, we can see that Reagan is clearly making the connection between a communist threat and the so-called domino effect, or this idea that if one country, leans to the left or goes left or adopts a socialist mode of governance, that it's going to spread to the next one and the next one, and it's going to become kind of a plague that can eventually overtake Latin America. He's making that connection between this communist threat and Central American immigration to the United States. So there's this sort of reference of millions of desperate Central Americans flocking to the United States, which, may actually be quite alarming kind of image for US citizens, certainly at that time and today as well. In reality, the Reagan administration itself was the most destabilizing force in Central America in the 20th century, authorizing billions of dollars of military aid to right-wing regimes in the region. These regimes have been found responsible for the vast majority of human rights abuses during the 1980s, including such gruesome events as the El Mozote massacre of some 1,000 men, women, and children in El Salvador, and the genocidal Scorched Earth campaign against indigenous Maya communities in Guatemala in the early 1980s. The UN-backed Commission for Historical Clarification documented over 600 massacres committed by the Guatemalan state, and found that 83% of the more than 40,000 registered victims were indigenous Maya, and they have characterized it as a genocide. Nicaragua, the country that I have done most of my work with, has a similarly troubled history with the United States. Indeed, historian Michael Goett writes in his book, Confronting the American Dream, Nicaragua Under US Imperial Rule, he writes, quote, U.S. intervention has marked few nations as profoundly as Nicaragua, unquote. Our interventionist history dates back to the mid-19th century when the U.S. became interested in Nicaragua's trans-isthmus passage. So the desire, emerged to build a canal, basically, that would connect the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans across Central America. But even after the construction of the Panama Canal in 1914, the U.S. continued to intervene in Nicaraguan affairs, seeking to prevent other foreign powers from developing a rival canal route. And this intervention culminated in the U.S. Marine occupation, so the military occupation of the country between 1912 and 1933, and support for the Somoza family dictatorship from 1936 to 1979. The Somoza regime was one of the longest dictatorships in the hemisphere, bestowing on Nicaragua a deep and enduring experience of authoritarianism and political violence. When the Somoza regime was overthrown by a popular leftist revolution led by the Sandinista National Liberation Front, or the FSLN, in 1979, the US began a powerful campaign to sabotage the revolution, which involved diplomatic isolation, 400 million in aid to the Contra, who are counter-revolutionary forces, the illegal mining of Nicaraguan harbors, and a debilitating trade embargo that really wreaked havoc on the Nicaraguan economy. After 2 decades and 2 wars, more than 80,000 Nicaraguans lost their lives. And today, much of the violence and insecurity that we see in places like El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua can really be traced to these histories of US intervention in the region, particularly during the Cold War era. The association between Latin American immigrants and contagion or disease really actually pre-exists the COVID-19 pandemic. In 1917, for instance, health officials used toxic chemicals, including gasoline baths, on immigrants at the US-Mexico border. The practice lasted into the 1960s when immigrant workers from Mexico associated with the Bracero program, which was a guest worker program, were subject to DDT fumigations before entry into the country. More recently, we saw it with the so-called surge in unaccompanied Central American minors at the border under the Obama administration in 2014, when some commentators began to associate the children with Ebola, tuberculosis, and smallpox. And of course, more recently, the implementation of Title 42 under the Trump administration and its continuance under Biden reflects a very similar threat narrative, which deeply informs immigration policy, actually. So just to tell you about Title 42, in March 2020, the Center for Disease Control enacted Title 42, one of the most restrictive US immigration policies ever, closing the border to all non-essential travel due to COVID-19. Since then, at least as of late spring, early summer, less than 1% of people arriving at the border have been allowed to seek protection. And these statistics are according to the Los Angeles Times. Claiming a more humane approach, the Biden administration has lifted the ban for unaccompanied minors, but has left Title 42 in place, stressing that the border remains closed and that people should stay at home and not come to the United States. At this point, most people encountered at the border are still rapidly expelled under Title 42 without credible fear interviews. And those are the interviews that immigration officials at the border have in the past routinely given to people who arrive to the United States asking for asylum or protection to kind of determine whether or not there is any kind of legal basis for that. So people are actually no longer really even allowed those credible fear interviews. And you may have seen the images of Border Patrol on horsebacks, literally corralling Haitians in Texas. Recently in the news, the majority of Haitians in this Del Rio camp in Texas have now been deported under Title 42 with no access to our asylum system, which denies their right to due process. So basically, procedures that would even minimally conform to our own national and to wider global legal frameworks for refugee protection are just no longer in place at the border. They simply don't exist. And this represents a complete failure of our refugee and asylum system at a time when xenophobia and nativism have been on the rise in the United States. And I just want to note that this policy really belies the reality that COVID-19 spread to Central America from Europe and the United States, not the other way around. Moreover, our immigration enforcement policies have promoted the spread of the virus. For instance, we continued to deport Central Americans to Guatemala under the Safe Third Country Agreement after the start of the pandemic. And some of these people were infected with COVID-19 in US custody, actually in detention centers before they were deported, and they went home and they contributed to community spread in their nations of origin. So I want to just say that, these pernicious threat narratives really don't tell us much of anything that's useful about Central America or Central American people themselves or their experiences or why they're coming here. But they do help us understand why the US has given bipartisan support for sanctions against leftist governments in Latin America, but not right-wing governments that also commit really dire human rights abuses. And they also help us understand why the US is happy to support Nicaraguan human rights in Nicaragua through, say, targeted sanctions, but not Nicaraguan rights at the US border. So I want to just sort of humanize the problem and bring it home to Michigan by sharing a story from one Nicaraguan asylee. And I call her an asylee because she actually did win asylum in the United States, political asylum, who despite her traumatic ordeal was lucky enough to make the journey through Central America and Mexico to the US border before the asylum system was basically shut down. Her name is Dayanira, and she's from a rural municipality in north central Nicaragua called Huaslala. In 2018, she participated in a national protest movement against the government of President Daniel Ortega and his wife and Vice President Rosario Murillo. The government was sparked by Social Security cuts. The movement was sparked by Social Security cuts, but when protests were met with state violence, it exploded into a much wider national movement against corruption and repression, which called for the removal of Ortega and Murillo from power. From late April to late July 2018, the Nicaraguan nation mobilized against the government. And this was a popular mobilization that included all different kinds of sectors of Nicaraguan society all over the entire nation. Students took over universities, citizens built roadblocks and barricades in their communities. People from all walks of life joined really mass demonstrations. And the Catholic Church actually attempted to mediate the crisis, but the state responded with just increased and intensified violence. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights found that the government forces had committed crimes against humanity during this period, including the assassination, arbitrary detention, persecution, rape, torture, and forced disappearance of thousands of civilians. And human rights reports detailed that at least 328 people were killed, and there were thousands of arbitrary detentions took place since April 2018. And as a result of all of this, more than 100,000 Nicaraguans have fled the country and are now in exile. About 70% of them went to Costa Rica because it's the country closest to Nicaragua. But we do have Nicaraguans who are in exile in countries in Central America, in South America, in Mexico, and many have also tried to come to the United States. So the repression ultimately forced Dayanira to flee as well. She had taken a lead role in the protest movement in Huaslala and was on a government hit list. At the time, she was working for an Italian construction firm that was training her to operate heavy machinery. And she was one of the very few women in Nicaragua who actually had this job. And she was quite proud of her ability to break into really a male-dominated sector and earn money to provide food and housing for her family. One day at work, she saw a caravan of paramilitaries, government armed and backed paramilitaries and police pass her work site. She told me, I felt like my soul had left my body. She spent the next 4 months sleeping in safe houses, so hiding out, in houses that were far from where her family was living. Each day she traveled to work on her motorcycle. She said, I was in a deep state of anxiety. I didn't sleep. I had dark circles under my eyes. I worked with really bad nerves. In November 2018, paramilitaries went to her company's office with a picture of her from her Facebook page. When she learned about this, she left for the United States the next day with another protester from Waslala. They traveled by bus and car to Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, and then to Mexico, where a friend of theirs arranged for a pollero, or a smuggler, to take them across the border at Reynosa in Mexico into McAllen in Texas. They crossed 3 weeks after leaving Nicaragua. And by the grace of God, Dayanira said only by the grace of God did she manage to evade the violence that many Central Americans experience as they travel through Mexico's. So migrants routinely experience extortion, kidnapping, physical and sexual assault along the migrant trail that goes all the way through from southern Mexico all the way up to the US border. And they are commonly preyed on by organized gangs as well as by Mexican government officials. Police, for instance, have been very commonly implicated in the violence committed towards migrants. 30 minutes after crossing the border, Dayanira and her group turned themselves into the US Border Patrol because their intention of coming to the United States was to seek political asylum. After everything she had been through, she told me that this was when her real ordeal started. She spent several days in what migrants call the hielera, or the ice box, with only a mylar cover for warmth. And these were holding, oftentimes sort of holding cages in big warehouses in McAllen that were so cold that people felt it was almost a form of torture and they would shiver. And you might have seen pictures of migrants with these kind of tinfoil looking covers wrapped around them, and those are mylar covers for warmth. She said the conditions were absolutely intolerable. There were times that I couldn't sit on the floor because there were so many people, she said, and there were children who were crying because they had been taken away from their parents. Children in the icebox crying alone, 7, 8, 9. 10 years old. So she's talking about a period during which the Trump administration promoted a policy of family separation where children were actually separated from their parents. So she's referencing that. She said the officers in Texas spoke Spanish with a Mexican accent and told them, "You aren't welcome here. We don't like people from other countries. Haven't you seen the news? They're deporting everyone who comes here." Soon after, she was transported to the Calhoun County Correctional Center in downtown Battle Creek, Michigan, which is about an hour away from Lansing. The Calhoun County Sheriff's Office signed a contract with the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Services in 1997 to hold immigrant detainees for a fee. The jail can hold 300 immigrants and bring in about $6 million in revenue each year, with more than 4 million coming directly from ICE, a source of, sadly, much needed public revenue for Michiganders who now sort of routinely deal with frequent municipal budgetary crisis due to state level cuts, as well as, dwindling tax base over time. When I asked Dayanira about the conditions in the jail, she replied, "I left that place a ball of stress." She spent 5 months there, fully integrated into the inmate population. Not long before her asylum hearing, she found pro bono representation from Wayne State University's law clinic, who have wonderful lawyers, professors, and wonderful law students who represent people seeking political asylum in federal immigration court in Detroit. And that's where I first saw her via video. She was being streamed into the court when I gave expert witness testimony on government repression in Nicaragua. Unlike most Central American asylum seekers, the judge granted Dayanira political asylum. She had a very well documented case, and she was released in April 2019. When I interviewed her in September 2019, she lived with a host family in Ann Arbor and was working 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, washing dishes in a restaurant. She spent her days off talking to her children on FaceTime. When I asked her about her hopes for the future, she told me she just wanted to go home and be with her family. Dayanira's story connects Nicaraguans, Mexicans, Texans, and Michiganders in a hemispheric chain of violence. Much of the violence, the immigrant detention industry, whether public or private, the violence of the US-Mexico borderlands, and the political instability and economic deprivation that Central Americans experience in their home every day have really been shaped by US intervention in the region. And so this leaves me with a final question for you to consider. What is our shared responsibility as a nation towards those desperate people who come to the US-Mexico border seeking refuge from the violence and precarity that our own government has helped to provoke? Thanks so much.
Thank you for that presentation and the thought-provoking questions that it leaves us with. As we go through, there's just a couple questions to help guide us, and then hopefully, again, a humanizing rapid kind of segment where we get to learn more about you, and then we'll turn it back over to you for some final takeaway thoughts. So one of the questions that we've heard as of late, and if you can speak to this, great, and if not, feel free to not, is kind of within the context of the threat narratives that compare and contrast what might be happening in Afghanistan compared to what might be happening with the Haitians in particular, and kind of looking at the narratives and along those lines. So I'm wondering if you've had some experience about that in general, or some thoughts about that in general, kind of comparing and contrasting the different narratives from example Afghanistan compared to example Haiti.
In terms of the danger that Afghan refugees might pose to,
yeah, they might not, like, are there some deeper seated comparisons behind, the different polls?
I think I understand what you're saying. Yeah, so you do find commonalities and threat narratives across sort of different groups of people. The Haitian people have been subject to particularly pernicious racialized threat narratives over time. Certainly in in decades past, one of the strongest threat narratives that they were subject to was the idea that they were a source of contagion in relationship to the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the United States. And they were routinely turned away from protection in the United States based on those kinds of threat narratives. I think in general, if you compare, for instance, the success of Cuban refugees coming to the United States to Haitian refugees, you really see a dramatic difference. We opposed the Castro regime, and so we were very happy to accept Cuban refugees to the United States, whereas we, in general, historically, supported many of the regimes in power in Haiti and also viewed them as somewhat less desirable well, significantly less desirable immigrants because they were poor and of African descent. And so, there's a class element there. There's a heavily racialized element there. And you see the geopolitical kind of aspect of that playing into it. With Afghanistan, I mean, this is just such a fascinating issue, or such an important issue, because if you look at some of the largest immigrant populations in the United States, they are groups of people that have come here because of US interventions in their country. So for Latin America, other than Mexicans, or Mexican Americans now, the largest immigrant population are people from El Salvador who fled during the Civil War. They were internally displaced, and then they fled the country and they came to the US. So we have really high numbers of Salvadoran, people of Salvadoran descent in the United States. And that's directly related to our, if you look at the Vietnamese, there's a very similar relationship with Vietnamese population in the United States. We have, pretty high numbers of Vietnamese people here because of our intervention in Vietnam. And the same thing I think is true of Afghanistan, or, well, it's not, I mean, Afghanistan is embedded in, I think, an anti-Muslim, Islamophobic threat narrative that has been particularly strong since 9/11, and has shaped US immigration policies really profoundly in the last, I would say decade or so. I mean, I remember a while back, Rick Schneider was the governor of Michigan, was, pioneering this program to resettle Syrian refugees in Michigan, because there's really good evidence that folks who are, immigrants come to Michigan and they make really positive contributions to our communities, and they build businesses, and their sources of innovation and employment and revenue are productive gain for our communities. But I believe around that time, there were a couple of terrorist attacks on civilians in Paris or something, and that initiative was absolutely completely shut down immediately. And then, of course, you have the so-called Muslim ban that was enacted under Trump. And so, certainly, all of those kinds of forces cascade and impact on the reception of Afghan refugees to the United States. I will just say that if you look at the number of refugees that the United States admits, it's nothing. It's tiny in comparison to the numbers of refugees that Costa Rica admits, or Mexico admits, or if you think about Lebanon, taking in Syrian refugees, it's just almost nothing. I mean, we have Kenya has, I don't even know how many refugees in that country, but yet we have this hyper kind of concern with really, really small numbers of refugees coming to the country. So I think each country has a slightly different story and is situated historically with threat narratives differently, but it certainly, impacts most people seeking refuge.
One of the things you just hinted to was a counter narrative around economic productivity in particular. I'm curious about other stories or examples of counter narratives that might highlight the benefits that you alluded to earlier in the discussion, and then also what you alluded to just recently in the Michigan attempt.
Yeah, well, there's been a good deal of research that's been done by sociologists, for instance, that focus on immigration. There's this wonderful Cuban-American sociologist named Ruben Rumboldt, who's done research, actually quantitative research on the impact of immigration. There's another, I think it's an economist named Giovanni Perry, who's done research on this. And they push back on all of these dominant immigration myths that exist in the United States. Primarily, those myths are that immigrants commit crimes, They've found pretty much across the board that people born in the United States commit dramatically more crimes than people born outside of the United States who come to the United States. And they really strongly push back again on this idea that immigrants take away jobs. There have been really good empirical quantitative studies that show that immigrants either have no impact on employment or wages for native born workers, or have a very small positive impact on them because they generate jobs, they can generate jobs. There's another myth that immigrants suck up all of the scarce resources and social services. And there have been studies that show again that that's not really the case. If you look at the productive contribution of immigrant workers, they are actually adding to our tax base. Many of them pay taxes on their labor directly to Social Security, and are not able to actually collect those benefits. And of course, they consume products and pay, purchasing tax. And so again, there are a lot of studies that just completely overturn all of these kind of so-called common sense or commonly held ideas about the dangers that immigrants pose.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
As you were speaking to the story of, is it Deianira in that
Diana.
experience,
Mhm.
what do you think she would want the typical student in the United States, Michigan specifically, to know about her experience that could help inform us, or help us maybe even shift some of our own traditional thinking? What would she want us to know, if you feel comfortable answering from your experience with her?
Well, I'm speculating, and I've interviewed quite a few people who particularly have fled to Costa Rica. I think the number one thing that Nicaraguans say is they feel like nobody cares about what's happening at home to them. Nobody knows about what's happening at home, and nobody actually cares. There was a good deal of publicity around what is called a civic insurrection, because it was a largely peaceful uprising or protest movement in 2018. And we saw it, in mainstream media quite a bit in the United States. But folks have said to me over and over again, after the government stopped slaughtering students in the street, nobody paid attention. But Nicaragua was living, under a police state right now. And some human rights sources have actually suggested that it has the worst deteriorating human rights situation with the least amount of freedom in the entire Western Hemisphere at this particular moment in time. The situation's really dreadful there. And so I think most of these folks would really like us to be better educated about what's happening in other countries, and educated in a way that is attuned to the actual everyday person's experience in that country. The other thing I think that comes out of her kind of narrative is that she felt that her experience in US detention was like almost as damaging to her as her journey through Mexico and her actual experience of being terrorized by the Nicaraguan government, which is really significant.
That's
She felt that it was a very violent and hostile experience to her. And she is somebody who, like the other 100,000 Nicaraguans who left Nicaragua have legitimate political asylum claims that are upheld under international law and actually US law. And many Central Americans have that. And so I think it's also important for us to realize, that we're not just protecting our own national interests, we're actually violating our own laws. We're not allowing people the due process that our laws provide them.
Yeah. So your comment about, recentering the conversation on the lived experiences of the individuals is really
Yeah.
powerful, and perhaps leads into what might be a final question for this moment, which is, if you had to give some advice to secondary teachers or even elementary teachers who might want to, broaden perspectives of their students, what might be some of the most impactful and powerful ways to introduce the concept of international relations, US policy and its implications, and just the overall relationship between US policy and the world?
I'm not a specialist, definitely not in elementary education. I feel maybe perhaps closer to, secondary teachers because I teach first year students at James Madison College who are literally 3 months, there's a 3-month separation between their experience in high school and their experience as first year students. I can say with my education, pretty much from start to finish, K through 12, I learned very little about, I certainly learned very little about Latin America, if hardly anything about Latin America. I learned very little that was critical or challenging about the U.S. role in the world. I think that there's a great fear about criticizing the United States in education, particularly K through 12 education these days. And I certainly sympathize with teachers who might have that fear of getting pushback from talking about those things. Because there is, definitely assault on that kind of free speech, I think, or, particularly in education, because it's such a tender topic for people, and it involves sort of social reproduction and the production of citizenship and the production of national identity and national forms of citizenship. But so it's really contested. But I would just urge people to do their best to go to the historical record, because it's there. The things that we've been talking about today are very well documented. Historians of Latin America don't fight over whether or not this happened or not. They know it happened. The UN says it happens. Human rights organs say it happened. It happened, so it's real. And so we're talking about our history. And I think that one of the most important things to remember, that if we can't remember the past, if we have this constant amnesia about what has happened, how are we really going to be able to educate globally aware and engaged citizens who have the knowledge that they need to make this a better world? And we desperately need that right now for everybody, both inside the United States and out.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't necessarily feel appropriate to shift to something a little bit lighter, but we would like to get to know the human side of you as a person, as a professional, because there's probably some things along your way that prompted your particular interest in this particular topic. So a couple kind of more trivial questions, and then we'll turn it over to you to kind of share what was your own pathway into this work, and a final takeaway question. So first are the more humanizing ones. So do you have a favorite color?
I like blue. Yes.
Okay. What kind of blue is probably the follow-up question for that one.
Oh, like a deep sky blue, dark blue. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not a pastel person in general. Yeah. But blue's been my favorite color since I was a little kid.
But you're at Michigan State, so there you go.
Oh yeah, I know.
Yeah.
That's probably not very,
That's
it has nothing to do with other loyalties, I promise you. And
okay.
I'm not fond of yellow either.
There you go. There you go. All right. How about a favorite like coffee shop beverage, a favorite like coffee or tea or anything along those lines?
So my usual order is a decaf iced latte. Yeah.
How about a favorite quote or saying that motivates you, or that you tend to revert to when you need to?
When there is no wind in your sails, the only way out is to row. This is actually from BKS Iyengar, who's a very famous now now passed on yoga teacher from India, but I like it, and I actually have it written on my my fridge. And I think, during these pandemic times when so many of us are so depleted, it's good to remember that all we need to do is just get up every morning and try our best to put one foot in front of the other. So,
Mhm.
yeah,
That's great. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. If you had a choice of superpowers, what might it be?
So ever since I was a kid, and this is going to reveal my age, but I remember watching, for instance, like Bewitched, and early Star Trek when I was a kid. And I've always wanted to have this ability to just kind of instantly move from one place to the other over long distances. And Bewitched, she used to just like do her nose, and she could, and I always imagined if I had that, I could go visit friends for an evening in Nicaragua and come right back and wake up and greet my son in the morning, or I could visit my aging parents every Sunday for Sunday dinner. And I always thought that would be the most amazing
Yeah.
power to have.
It would certainly make the research easier if you just had a quick
Oh my
question. You're like, I'm just going to
gosh,
pop
yes.
over and
Can you
yeah.
imagine? Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Final question.
Okay.
Favorite song or artist? It's a tough one.
That's a really tough one. I don't think I have one favorite.
Or someone maybe as of late that you've been enjoying,
A what?
like someone that you've been listening to lately, or a song as of late that is more interesting or appealing.
I have a 3.5-year-old, so like I'm constantly barraged with like Raffi and like other children's
Yeah.
music, and I haven't really been listening to anything. I do like Latin American music. There's these wonderful um kind of folk singers from Latin America, like Silvio Rodriguez, that I like quite a bit. But I know that at least my past tastes in music have been much more broad and interesting than that. But I think
But
that
Rafi in the
toddler
meantime, yeah.
music, yeah, I
Yeah.
think toddler music is kind of, yeah,
The Mickey Mouse Clubhouse and
exactly.
right, all of that. All right. So again, we want to just thank you for your time, your expertise, and your care to share your stories and your research and your analysis with us tonight. And in addition to the question about what shared responsibility do we have to the world, might there be any other final takeaways or a suggestion of your own path into this work that we can leave this evening with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're reaching a historical moment where there's a growing recognition that our practices and policies of the past aren't serving us well and aren't going to take us into the future well. Um, and I think that, this is relevant in relationship to certainly global climate change, um, public health, and I think immigration and refugee issues are similar. And I am not an individual who feels hopeless about the future. I teach some really amazing students who came out of Michigan high schools, primarily at James Madison College, who have all of this kind of visionary hope and excitement about trying to make the world that we live in a better place. And so I have this tremendous kind of, faith in young people's ability to enact change. I think that if we've made the world into a certain kind of place, we can remake it into a different kind of place. Um, so that's just a final leaving thought. Yeah.
Beautifully said. Absolutely. People who can participate in the world as it is while working to make the future an even better place. Thank you
Right.
for that.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time tonight. We really appreciate the dialogue, the stories, and the experiences that you had to share. And we
Yes.
will post this up on both the Michigan Center for Civic Education YouTube channel, and we'll
Okay.
also link it up on our community conversations page on our website. And to thank you to all who are watching, please feel free to reach out. We are so excited about your involvement with the Michigan Center for Civic Education, and thank you again for all of your expertise. Thank
It's
you.
my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.